Ian Macdonald, can you tell us how happened that you came to be a defender in courts of black people?
Well, I mean, it started when I first started at the bar, and I used to get black clients amongst others. And I had, in fact, at that stage also been involved in anti-racist politics. And I started doing most of the cases for an organisation called West Indian Standing Conference. And these were, raids on parties, mostly people coming out of parties being attacked by police dogs, parties being raided for the unlawful sale of alcohol and things like that. And I learnt resistance in the courts from my clients, because these guys, who would be the parents and grandparents of the present generation of black youth, said, we didn't do it and you go out there and you tell them. And so that I learnt an awful lot from these guys. They were mostly guys working in factories, who at weekends would go to a party, they would have a party, and in some cases they were the organisers of parties. And they had it very rough, they had it very tough, but they were tremendous resistors.
So one of the well-known cases you were first involved in was the Mangrove Nine. So can you tell us about this case?
Well, the Mangrove Nine was came.
Can you just tell Mangrove Nine? Okay.
Yeah, the Mangrove Nine came in '71, and it was really an attempt to put on trial the leadership of the Black Panther Movement, which was one of the largest mass movements of black youth that there's ever been in this country. And what we were trying to do in that case was to take into court the resistance which the movement had been conducting out on the streets. And one of the roles which I was playing was I was one of the lawyers in it. 3 of the defendants were representing themselves. And I was really there to ensure that there was no split between those who were defending themselves and those who were represented, because the tendency of all lawyers is to take over and manage their clients. I mean, that is part of our training. And one of the things which was really important at that time was allowing the self-activity that political movement had generated to carry on in resisting in the court a frame-up, basically. And it was very successful. The trial lasted for something like 12 weeks. And I got into a lot of trouble because I made a speech to the jury at the end of the trial about judicial tyranny, because the judge had tried to treat the people in the dock with what we term judicial tyranny. And the outcome of that was that I was eventually told by the powers that be in the legal profession that it was the duty of a barrister to resist judges if they were, and it was because of the strength of the movement that I wasn't in fact disbarred or anything, and I hadn't done anything wrong except that I had fought a trial in the way that one ought to fight a trial, and where the court was attempting to railroad people into guilty verdicts, it was important to resist. It was a watershed trial because after that there was a very big change of attitude of judges in trials of this kind. It was the beginning of a realization that the police didn't behave like gentlemen and all the rest of it, by the establishment in this country. Because before that time, if you suggested in court to a policeman that he was telling lies, the reaction of the judges would be, "Are you suggesting that this man's going to put his wife and his pension at risk by telling lies?" And you immediately had a hostile judicial reaction to your attack on the police truthfulness. Now that has all changed. I mean, it is a completely different climate now. I mean, we now have the situation with the appeal of the Birmingham bombers, where scientific evidence has proved not just that some small-time junior police officers has lied, but that the whole of that investigation is one where counsel can say openly in court, and no one says no, that they have all lied and perjured and fitted up and framed these people. Now, you couldn't have done that, and you wouldn't have had the kind of police investigation that used the latest scientific techniques to see whether or not those confessions were faked. And that has come about as a result of the resistance, and particularly the organised black resistance to the abuse of police power. And it's had enormous ramifications on the whole of our society and on the whole system of justice, so that it's not a purely black issue at all. There's no doubt about it that because of the whole Irish question, that there has been an element of corruption of the judicial process, which we have recently seen exposed. But one of the reasons why it's been possible to make that exposure at this time is because of the contribution that has been made by the black organisations throughout the 60s and particularly the 70s, less so in the 80s.
Can you tell us about the efficiency of the campaigns which took place in the 60s? Apparently the people were fighting back and telling we're not more victims anymore, we are protagonists, meaning fighting back. How did you manage to win cases on this offensive stand?
Well, we had to make a certain assumptions. First of all, in England, in all these major cases, they were cases of trial by jury, rather than cases of trial by magistrates only. The more serious an offence, the more likely it is that it'll be tried by a jury. And juries are 12 people who are taken from the voters' register and brought to court. They're not people who've ever met each other. And they are a cross-section of the population. And so one of the things that we had to do, we had to make certain assumptions about the level of resistance that existed in the population as a whole. Now, most people, there's a side of most people which is deferential to authority. There's another side of most people which is rebellious against authority. And it was really appealing or organising to appeal to the rebellious side, rather than the prosecution would be trying to appeal to the side that defers to authority. And where there were such obvious and blatant abuses of power which were going on, and given, and this is really an important thing, that 1968 was a watershed, because it didn't just involve the emergence of the biggest youth movement, black youth movement in this country. There was also rent strikes going on. There was also the worldwide student movement. And there was in this country an enormous resistance organised mainly through an unofficial shop stewards movement within the trade union movement to an incomes policy which the Wilson government was trying to impose on the whole working class. And so there was an enormous level of working class organisation at practically every stage within the hierarchy of the working class. And so people of that kind coming in and sitting in court as members of a jury were much more susceptible to seeing the real truth of police behaviour. And so the reason why the resistance in the courts was successful was, in my view, because there was a level of organisation among the population as a whole. And I think that is a situation which is quite different today, where there's a much greater quietism among the working class. There isn't the same agitation, there isn't the same amount of things going on out in the street. And therefore, it's much more difficult to, if you have a section of the population that's resisting, it's probably sticking out a bit like a sore thumb nowadays, and will not perhaps receive quite the same sympathetic responses from a jury as we were getting in the 70s. But of course, because of what we got in the 70s, there is absolutely no doubt about it that the abuses of power by the police are much, much less today than they were then. They had to clean up their act, and particularly in those areas where the resistance was greatest. In areas like Birmingham, where there wasn't the same kind of resistance, where there didn't develop as there did in London, lawyers who were prepared to fight and confront in court, you find that you have a police force that in fact becomes more and more corrupt. And it's only now, in the last couple of years, that that has been exposed.
Okay. So another question about the relation between yourself as a lawyer defending black people in courts and the public campaigns which took place around these cases. What kind of relation did you build up with the campaigns?
Well, obviously, as a lawyer, in these cases, I mean, I am briefed professionally, and therefore I've always tried in those particular cases to keep a distance between the campaign as such and my job as a professional representative. But of course, when you go into court, unless you're aware of the kind of things that the campaign is attempting to do and are a bit in tune with it, you will not be able to express the sentiments or perhaps to accurately gauge what is happening, because one of the things that representation in court requires is that you're very aware of the different interplays of power and of human personalities that are going on in a court, and the kind of responses that are needed at a particular time. But of course, so far as the organised campaigns are concerned, I have throughout my professional career been very aware of and very much in support of the overall direction of those campaigns.
So what do you think about these campaigns around, for instance, the New Cross massacre? Did they help in the investigation?
Well, I mean, that was when that fire happened. It was quite clear that for thousands of black people in London and up and down the land, that what had happened to those children, in a sense, they saw as a metaphor for their own experiences. And there was therefore a mass response to the fires and to the deaths. And that mass response was undoubtedly of critical importance to, first of all, preventing there being a whitewash over the inquiry. Secondly, it prevented some of the people who were attending the party from being accused of setting the fire, which is the direction of all the police inquiries. And they picked on all the party-goers who had been in trouble with the police and were therefore the most vulnerable to police pressure. And without that mass movement, they may very well have been successful. The matter still remains unsolved.
So, coming to today, situation today, how do you feel about the transmission of the experience of resistance? As you were saying before, the resistance seems less. What do you think about the situation
Well,
today?
I think one of the things that's happened is some of the gains of the 60s and 70s have, in a sense, been formalised and institutionalised in the practice of the courts. And I think in a way that what we are seeing in the Birmingham 6 trial, or the Birmingham 6 appeal, is an element of the way that institutionalisation of those gains is working itself out in the court, in the courtroom. I think the situation today is a lot more confused because there are undoubtedly, large sections of youth who are very demoralised. There are people who are, in a sense, going to be part of a completely lost generation. And there is a tremendous amount of aggression and anger and violence which erupts in a very vicious and quite nasty way, and usually against people who are nearest and also vulnerable, girlfriends, wives, fellow youths, and that is obviously not something around which there's going to be any kind of political organisation. It seems to be a phenomena of inner cities or large inner cities, that a section of youth is, through drugs, through psychological disorders and other things, are being completely lost, and they don't have the appropriate responses, human responses, and that's a very serious problem because their targets are completely indiscriminate.
In the same time, we have seen since the middle of the 80s, appearing a black middle class. So among this class, there are a number of black lawyers. So what do you think about them?
Well, I work with a number of black lawyers, and I think that some of them, because they have been brought up in the 70s, they had their childhood in the 60s or the 70s, they have a tremendous understanding of what is going on. Some of those are obviously going to be successful in a conventional sense, and I have no doubt that some of them will end up as judges and will no doubt be very good judges. I also know that some of my colleagues are likely to be the great lawyers of their generation. Not because that is already, we've moved past that, not just representing black clients, but being the chosen lawyer for any client because they're the best. And I can see 3 or 4 people that I know of who would fit into that category.
Such as?
I'm not going to name names because they might have to go out and buy much larger hats than they already wear.
Okay. Can you tell us about what's the situation of racist attacks today?
Well, racist attacks are there's no abatement of racist attacks. they go on. They don't always take quite the same form. They're at least nowadays, because of the resistance to those, there is a recognition by the authorities and by the police that racist attacks are something that have to be dealt with. And that's come about in a very similar way to a recognition by the police that rape is a serious business, and that came about because of the organisation of women into anti-rape movements. Racist attacks and the way that the police deal with them and the way the authorities deal with them is still highly unsatisfactory, because you still have, in a situation now which is happening quite often, where there has been a whole series of racist harassment, and a group of black youths, particularly Asian youths, decide that they're going to do something about it. And of course, when they do something about it, that happens to be the moment when the police arrive, and they end up being arrested, and they end up being tried, and they end up, in some cases, being imprisoned. And nothing has been done about the thing that set that off. And that's happening all too often. And of course, there is obviously still a high level of racist harassment, name-calling and so forth in schools. There's a lot of racism on housing estates, and so forth. And one has to say also that in a lot of the attacks, you will have, if you like, integrated gangs of white and black youths attacking a group of Asians. And that's also something where different communities within the black population are attacking each other.
So what do you think about this new type of organization through the Muslim network?
Well, a lot of the leaders of the traditional leaders of the Muslim community, particularly those who are close to the mosque, have been very, very disturbed by the growth of independent Asian youth movements, which comprise Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Christian youths who are organizing their social life together, who are dating Muslim girls or Sikh boys, and they are attempting to recover lost ground, and a lot of the expression of fundamentalism is an attempt to regain some kind of control over the youth. One of the things that was very apparent during my experience in the Burnage inquiry was that the colleagues of the young boy who was murdered, and some of the Asian youths who saw what had happened to him as a metaphor for their own lives, attempted to organize an independent movement, and the effect of that on the traditional community leaders was that they used every single possible means, through the mosque, through the city council, and through the police, and through the parents, to stop this movement happening. And so I see the growth of fundamentalism and the call for separate Muslim schools as a quite desperate attempt by the traditional community leaders to organize something that will capture or recapture a lost youth. And they are thoroughly reactionary movements, and they, I think, are going to lose. They're going to fail. They cannot recapture that youth.
Don't you think that the racist attack targets the priority today Islam, Muslims?
Well, there has been quite obviously during the Gulf crisis and previously because of the Salman Rushdie business. One of the things that's happened, of course, is that the white racists have been attacking Asians and not calling them Pakis anymore, but calling them Muslims. And so there's been a shift of that, and that is to be deplored. But what you also have to see is precisely the kind of dialectical process that is taking place. Because some of the things that I've heard of happening, for instance, in the East End, is terrible. But of course, the working class, when it is not fighting back, but is sitting at home waiting for something to happen, will always have some incredibly reactionary traits which they will exhibit, and particularly against any other section of the working class that they perceive of as being different, who can be defined, as in Northern Ireland, by religion, as is happening in the East End, supposedly by religion, or is happening by way of colour. And that we've always had.